Lawmaker wants to help residents who have insurance through Louisiana Citizens.
Sabrina Wilson has more on that and his other insurance reform proposals.
While more insurers are expected to begin writing new wind and hail policies in Louisiana soon, thanks to financial incentives from the state, tens of thousands of homeowners are forced to get their coverage from the state's insurer of last resort, Louisiana Citizens Insurance Corporation. And by design, its premiums are supposed to be more expensive.
Proposing that we remove the mandatory 10% above the market rate for Citizens policyholders.
State Representative Raymond Garofalo will have legislation during the regular legislative session, which begins next month, to accomplish that. So if this passes, this would not automatically reduce the premiums of people who have their insurance with Louisiana Citizens?
It'll reduce all new policies, and we're still working out the details as to whether or not it would be retroactive.
In January, Louisiana Citizens implemented a 63% rate hike. In the aftermath of Hurricanes Laura and Ida, some insurers failed financially and others stopped writing new policies. So the number of policyholders Citizens inherited ballooned to 135,000.
We know that with all the catastrophes and the crisis that we've seen, that rates are exorbitant.
And if that legislation becomes law, Garofalo doesn't think it will impair the operations of Louisiana Citizens.
This, on its own, should not affect Citizens' ability to pay claims or do what Citizens has to do.
Garofalo has other insurance-related bills. One deals with clarifying that the Insurance Fraud Board can investigate more than auto insurance fraud.
My bill will clarify that this Insurance Fraud Board will look into all sorts of insurance. And when we have fraudulent claims, they'll investigate that and hopefully weed out some of those bad actors that are causing rates to go up for everyone.
Another would force insurers to inform their customers that they could save on premiums if they harden their roofs.
My bill would require them to tell the ratepayers what their reduction will be if they fortify their roof. I think it's going to help incentivize people in addition to the grants that we're hoping to offer.
And a fourth would let Louisianans set up a catastrophic insurance savings account.
That money would sit there. If there's a loss, that money would be the first money that would be used on the loss, and their rates would hopefully go down. The second thing the bill would do, it would allow either residential or commercial policyholders with the same type of account to basically self-insure if they're financially able to do it.
Garofalo says he's talked to Insurance Commissioner Jim Donelon to make sure his proposals wouldn't hurt efforts to attract more insurance companies to Louisiana. I reached out to Louisiana Citizens Insurance for a comment for this story, but so far haven't heard back.